Right, I'd like to kick off this discussion by introducing my research on the ideology of economic growth. Over the last 10 or 11 years, I think, I've published over a dozen papers and book chapters in which I try to make sense of it and to situate it historically. And it also relates to debates on green growth and degrowth. I've become involved in these debates too. Growth ideology, I first became curious about it when I lived in the GDR, and I was studying that society in comparison to the Federal Republic next door. These were two societies, quite different in some ways, but two core ideologies of both regimes were pretty much the same. One of them was nationalism. The other was the growth paradigm. By the growth paradigm, I mean the representation of economic growth as something that's inherently good. It's a necessary, a vital part of social existence. It's essentially continuous, maybe even limitless, and it's the main remedy for all kinds of social problems. This is a complex ideology. It's made up of many strands. It operates in many multiple ways. So when we are asking about its origins, the answer isn't going to come in a neat, simple package. But in my research on this, I studied many pre-modern societies, and I found no recognizable growth ideology or growth theory in any of them. There are glimpses, of course. I mean, ancient civilizations knew certain forms of expansion. Warlords could gain territory and monarchs could amass treasure and so on. And occasionally you even find reflections on growth dynamics. I think most impressively in the work of Ibn Khaldun, but you don't find anything at all like the modern growth paradigm. And that's no great surprise, given that sustained economic growth is such a recent phenomenon. For almost all the time that human beings have existed, there was no sustained growth, even though we assume that it's natural somehow. Growth is a modern phenomenon, and the growth paradigm is a modern ideology. But how modern? Some would argue that it really emerged in the mid-20th century, a time of empires coming to an end, of invention of econometrics, a time of Keynes and Kuznets, and the invention of GDP, and a time of total war. So what all those different elements mean was that there was quite suddenly much more clearly defined national economies that could act as the vehicles of growth, and there was a way of measuring growth, and there was the need to, in wartime, to plan resource allocation, not just in war, but for steering out of the Great Depression and then mobilization in war. And that argument has something to it. It's fair to say that the concepts of national economy and growth really took off at this time. But I think the key juncture, the really originating moment, came much earlier. It was 17th century England, as far as I can tell anyway. This is the period in which the word growth in the English language anyway moved from a term referring to concrete particulars in nature to abstract universals, including economic categories. This was the age of improvement, of so-called, of market expansion. It was the age in which economic life began to be theorized as if it's a complex system like the natural world, one that's governed by laws and one that's capable of growing. And that growth could, for the first time, be measured. The key individuals in this development, I think, were Francis Bacon, William Petty, Josiah Child, John Locke, and Nicholas Barbon, and then in the next century, early the next century, Bernard Mandeville. That's the argument I've been making in a series of publications. And it's no coincidence that this century, the 17th century, saw the breakthrough of a new mode of production, one that's geared to the compulsive accumulation of capital. So with capitalism, you saw not only a gear change in productivity growth, but also this was the time when growth began to become ideology. You see, in capitalism, the goal of production is accumulation. But if that is how the system appeared, it would lack legitimacy. It would look rather brutal, a system for enriching the already rich and powerful on the backs of the rest of us. But if the accumulation drive can be refigured as a growth drive, it all smells a whole lot prettier. So by calling growth an ideology, what I'm drawing attention to is how the particular interest of a social group in power comes to be represented as the general interest in a way that seems to naturalize relations of power and to naturalize and justify, therefore, the existing social order. So when when they're presented as growth, the acts of businesses, which are largely governed by their urge for profit, those acts carry the aura of the common welfare. Their profitability comes to appear as the condition for the satisfaction of universal welfare, the welfare of all. And ultimately, that's because most of the world, including our conditions of work and life, is owned by capitals in competition with one another over profit. And growth is the perfect term to refer to this ideology, because the roots of the word lie in words for flourishing and becoming green. It's the connotations of the word are of continuity, of gradual development, and of unity. It's the social whole that grows, even though in another sense growth is actually destroying the planet on which we live. It's turning it from green to brown.